在书店里看见你，看见你头上的白发，草地上的白菊花。
无所事事地面对着窗外，寒风吹皱了我们的记忆。冬天一去，冬天一去。
This is the moment when we will confer the 6th Newman Prize for Chinese Literature to Xi.
依然是清晨里微弱的阳光，依然是冰雪里永恒的希望。冬天一去，冬天一去，春天在遥远里向我们招手。
近来我常常看见白菊花，在喝下午茶的地方，在放映实验电影的地方，在你们走来走去的地方。
Hello everyone, welcome to this conversation on Xi and the World, 西西与世界, which is the first episode of the series Xi Spring Gaze, 西西春望, organized by the Hong Kong Poetry Festival Foundation. My name is Tammy Lai Ming Ho. I am the editor-in-chief of Cha and Asian Literary Journal and the English editor of the Hong Kong-based Voice and Verse Poetry magazine. We have two guest speakers today. The first is the award-winning translator, Dr. Jennifer Feely.
Hello.
Jennifer's translations include Carnival of Animals, Dong Galimwa, a collection of Xi's animal poems, which has just been published by the Columbia University Press, and Not Written Words, Hasimanzi, the first book in English translation of Xi's poetry. Jennifer is currently translating two other books by Xi, Morning at West, Oido Yufeng, and My City, Nursing. Her translation of My City will be the first unabridged English version of this iconic book. Jennifer will be talking today about her observations of Xi's work from the perspective of both the translator and the reader. We also have Dr. Jonathan Stalling.
Hi, Tammy. Hi, everyone. Honored to be here.
Jonathan is a professor of English at the University of Oklahoma. He directs and curates a number of scholarly programs, including the Institute for U.S.-China Issues, the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature, and the Chinese Literature Translation Archive. Jonathan's research specializes in comparative U.S.-China culture, literature, and poetics, as well as Chinese English translation and interlanguage studies. He will be speaking to us about the Prize for Chinese Literature, which was awarded to Xi in 2019, making her the first Hong Kong writer to win it. Today's topic is Xi and the world. I'm going to first provide a biography of Xi, focusing on her writing, and then I will invite Jennifer and Jonathan to take turns to read English translations of Xi's work and give us their take on Xi and the world. Xi is one of the most successful and best-known Hong Kong writers, whose works are read and appreciated by a wide readership, both in Hong Kong and internationally. Xi was born in Shanghai in 1937, She came to Hong Kong with her family in 1950 at aged 13, growing up and working as a school teacher for 20 years in colonial Hong Kong. Cece created a body of work that speaks to life in the city in the days both before and after the handover in 1997. Although originally from the mainland, Cece considered herself a Hong Konger, an identity reflected in much of her work. Jennifer Feely has said that, and I quote her, "Cece is a Hong Kong poet, and her Hong Kong writer's angle can be found throughout her poetry." Unquote. Cece started writing at a young age. Her decades-long career yielded numerous wide-ranging works that testify to her preferred themes, her styles of writing, her personal and sentimental attachments, and her persistence in being always creative. She is a versatile writer who constantly sought new ways to build worlds and tell stories. For example, she once said, "To write a novel is to write new content or to write using a new method. If both are absent, I'd rather not write." Cece excelled in multiple genres. She wrote stories, novels, poetry, essays, fairy tales, screenplays, newspaper columns. She created collages, she painted, she sold teddy bears and crafted doll houses, and she was interested in film history, artwork, world literature, architecture, football, her fellow little citizens, 小市民, or little people, 小人物, and of course her city, for she is a city writer. Cece won several major awards in her lifetime, including the prestigious Newman Prize for Chinese Literature and the Cicada Prize, as well as the Life Achievement Award presented by the Hong Kong Arts Development Council in 2022. Some of Cece's most well-known works are My City, Deer Hunt, Sao Luk, Marvels of a Floating City, 浮城之夜, Morning Abreast, Flying Carpet, Fade In, and her short stories, notably A Girl Like Me, 像我這樣的一個女子, The Code, and Maria. Her last work was the novel Yam Tien Gam, which was published in February last year, before her death in December 2022. Cece's writings sometimes have autobiographical elements, such as Morning Abreast, which records her personal experience of breast cancer, and Birds of Passage, Hao Liu, a fictionalized version of Cece's life from girlhood to being a young woman, from primary school student to graduating secondary school and being offered a place to study at Wrexham College of Education to become a teacher. Cece's works have been variously described as feminine, intellectual, painterly, cinematic, cross-media, postmodern, fable-like, metafictional, and intertextual. She is known to shed the spotlight on those who are socially marginalized in the city, the working class, women, and the young. A number of her poems are narrated by young or youthful voices, while the novel My City is focused primarily on younger people's viewpoints. Commenting on her emphasis on young people in that book, Cece said, "I write about them, about their attitude towards life, but I didn't want to focus on one particular person. Don't forget that's the age of anti-heroism. Their jobs are humble. Park keeper, telephone technician, nothing important. Their lives are full of challenges, but they work hard and they are happy. The novel is dedicated to these nameless heroes." Unquote. We often associate Cece with Hong Kong and Hong Kong writing. Her works give off an unmistakable aura of the city. Consider the works My City, Flying Carpet, and Marvels of a Floating City, all about Hong Kong. There is also Fertile Soil Town, 肥土鎮, a fictional Hong Kong that appears in several of Cece's stories. While these texts are about a city, the Mary Building, 美麗大廈, is modeled on an apartment block in To Kwa Wan, Kowloon, where Cece lived half her life. The Mary Building narrates the lives of an array of characters. It's a city condensed in one building. But in Cici's work, we can also see universal topics: childhood, illnesses, difficulties faced by women, the city experience, alienation and loneliness, but also comradeship, and finding sparks of life in the smallest things. There are also traces and influences of world literature and cinema. We know her world is not limited to Hong Kong, but is broad and outward looking. Critics have noted the Western cinematic techniques as adopted by Cici and the influences of writers such as Gunter Grass, Italo Calvino, and the Latin American writers Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Borges, and also filmmakers such as Ingmar Bergman and Francois Truffaut. In 1966, Cici even wrote a screenplay adapted from Louisa May Alcott's 1868 novel, Little Women. One can also find echoes of Camus' The Stranger in Cici's East Side Story, Dongxing Guxi. Not only does this title um, allude to the 1961 film adaptation of the Shakespeare-inspired musical West Side Story, there are also plot and name references to that film. On the other hand, Flaubert's Madame Bovary features in Cici's Morning Abreast, and the protagonist compares 4 different translations of the French novel. Cici's characters are also not restricted to people in Hong Kong. Her first published short story, Maria, in print in 1964, is about a French nun in the Congo. The story describes the horror of war. These examples, even though they are only impressionistically presented, hopefully can offer us a glimpse of Cici's expansive and worldly writing. While we can find Western influences and elements in Cici's work, a direct way of making her writing available to the world is through translation. Cici has been translated into English, French, and Korean, and I believe in German as well soon. We are very fortunate today to have Jennifer Feely. As I previously said, Jennifer has translated 2 books of Cici's poetry and is working on translating 2 more books of prose by Cici. She's She's going to read perhaps 1 or 2 passages from Morning Abreast, and she will talk about Cici and translation. Jennifer?
Thank you, Tammy, for that rich introduction to Shishi's incredible life and her literary legacy. And I just want to say thank you to the Hong Kong Poetry Festival Foundation for putting together this event. I think we're all really honored to be here to honor Shishi, to celebrate her. So thank you. And thank you to all of you watching. When I heard that the theme for today's roundtable was Shishi in the world, my mind immediately drifted to translation because I am one of Shishi's translators. But I first would like to start by reading a passage from this book that Tammy mentioned, Morning Abreast, which was published in 1992 and is a semi-autobiographical work about Shishi's experience with breast cancer. It's quite interesting in terms of genre because the publisher in Taiwan classifies it as a novel, but I believe the English language publisher might be classifying it as an essay collection. I'm not sure yet. In her preface to the book, Shishi encourages readers to classify it however they want. And so in this book, readers might be surprised that she writes a lot about translation and a lot about world literature. So I would like to read a passage from a chapter called The Body's Language, in which Shishi uses translation as a way to understand what is happening with her body. If you open the new Chinese translation of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, you'll find the following commentary from the translator. I have compared the English and Japanese translations of the book and discovered quite a few problems with the translations, especially the English version, where mistranslations and omissions are common. End quote. Indeed, In recent years, many people have pointed out that a number of translations are riddled with mistranslations, misinterpretations, omissions, and adaptations. There are unintentional misunderstandings, as well as deliberate simplifications that go as far as rewriting the text. It seems that if we want to better understand the original work, we need to seek out multiple translations for comparison, hope that someone else will retranslate the text, or simply learn more foreign languages. But don't assume that I am searching for the ultimate perfect translation. I am not. There's never a fixed and eternal absolute spirit in books. Translations are interpretations, and the same text holds the possibility of multiple interpretations. Each interpreter can thus proclaim, Madame Bovary is me, and no one will object that there are too many Madame Bovarys. We've benefited from misreadings and retranslations for a long time. Dare I say that it is impossible to have a sole, absolute version of a translation, whether now or in the future. This is the end of the passage I'm reading, and it's really remarkable to open this book, which is about navigating her journey with cancer, and to find so many rich passages about translation. And from this, we can see that Xi, who herself was a translator, is extremely well aware of the role that translation plays in the circulation of world literature. And I feel much better as one of her translators, knowing that she's well aware that translations are full of mistranslations and misinterpretations, and that she's open to multiple interpretations and translations of her work. And I wanted to read another short passage from Morning Abreast that's about translation. This is from a chapter called The Doctor Says. As Tammy said, that in this chapter, the narrator, she's getting ready to have a surgical procedure, and while she's waiting, she opens up her bag and pulls out 4 different versions of Madame Bovary. So we have the French version, 2 Chinese translations, and an English translation. And she starts comparing them in terms of not the language, but punctuation and typeface, specifically the use of italics. And then after this, she starts reflecting about how difficult it is to be a translator. And she writes, "The Chinese are fortunate to have good translators and excellent translations. Translators, however, rarely win literary prizes. It's always fiction, poetry, prose, drama, and literary criticism, but nothing for translation. Translation is extremely challenging work, and good translation is even more challenging. There are translation awards in foreign countries. For example, Gregory Rabas's translation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's The Autumn of the Patriarch received the PEN America Center Translation Prize in 1977. Translating those immensely complicated paragraphs must have been arduous. There are no prizes for literary translators in China. In recent years, there's been a new crop of Latin American literature translators. I've read many of their translations, but no one ever mentions their name when talking about literature." So this is the second passage I wanted to read because, again, it reveals her understanding for the ecosystem of translation and her awareness of the often unfortunate invisibility of the translator. And it shows that she appreciates the effort that translators put into their work. So for me, as one of her translators, I feel very blessed when I read passages like this because it lets me know that she appreciates and understands what I'm doing. And I very quickly now want to turn to translation from a different angle, that is what translation has done for Xi in her career. And I think Jonathan will pick up on this after and continue with it. So in the 80s and 90s, several of her works were translated into English. Most of these were published in books or journals in Hong Kong. One of the problems with this is, in many cases, it can be very hard to get those books if you are not in Hong Kong. The translations are wonderful. It's just, it can be really hard to get your hands on some of them. And I think that this is one of the reasons that a lot of English readers outside of Hong Kong were not necessarily aware of her work because they just weren't reading it. They didn't have access to it. It's impacted her global reach. And so I'm really heartened to see that more of her work is being translated into multiple languages. And part of the reason that these prose works of hers are getting more of a global reach is she now is being represented by an extraordinary literary agent, Li Kangqin at New River, who is able to access publishers that authors and translators cannot. And I'm very grateful to her because she's also is the one who is responsible for bringing my city into German with a very prestigious press whose name I'm going to butcher, Surkamp. And I know that there are translators into other languages who are interested in translating her work. I just received a query from a Polish translator. She works from Chinese into Polish, and she wants to get in touch with Xi's agent because she would like to translate more of her work into Polish. And I know there are French language translators who want to bring more of her work into French. I believe her work has been, at least her poetry was translated into Swedish, which helped with winning the Cicada Prize. And I am going to turn it over now to Jonathan to continue on this thread of translation.
Jonathan, can you perhaps also read something by Xi and tell us about your role in the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature and the significance of Xi's winning the prize?
Absolutely. I will go ahead and start with a poem, mostly because nothing I can say can compare. And I just want to move our conversation toward poetry for a moment, because of course, one of the great interventions that Tammy, that you made, and of course, Jennifer too, as a translator, you know, we're advocates for various voices and also genres, and we're trying to bring attention to that work. And so a translation does bring a work, you know, into proximity with readers, but it doesn't guarantee that readers will ever discover it. So prizes are there to make translated work more discoverable, right? So it may be there, but it's not being read. So bringing attention to it is a really important part of literary advocacy. So I'll talk a little bit about the Newman Prize and how it does that, and how important I think it is that Xi's recognition as a poet stems from, you know, the agency of individuals like Tammy and Jennifer. But let's go ahead and I'm going to read this poem from 不是文字. This is the book that Jennifer mentioned, published a few years ago in her translation, Not Written Words, by Zephyr Press. The poem is, what I'm thinking of is not written words. Straightforward and crystal clear, what I'm thinking of is not merely written words. Words can be embellished, well-versed at subterfuge. Some people's words are tangled and tongue-tied, and words have 7 types of ambiguity. They speak obscurely, pointing west but heading east. And so what I'm thinking of is actually a certain woman's temperament. Speaking of such a woman, I'm rather awkward at expressing myself precisely, of grasping what I mean to say, because I believe that life will always be more transcendent than words, livelier than words, more capable than words of witnessing the test of time. The poem is extraordinary because, of course, it is able to be read on so many different levels in terms of, you know, referencing the indeterminacy of language, but also the inability, the prosthetics of language to map, but not in fact make present, and the interdimensional nature of life itself. And I want to get back to maybe talking a little bit about her poetry and poetics in a moment, but just to at first presence the fact that she's an extraordinary poet. And yet, even myself, who reads widely and am actively engaged in Sinophone poetry, when Tammy nominated Xi for the Newman Prize, I was really surprised to see her name there, because I thought, oh, this is really important prose fiction writer, but what is her poetry like? So I purchased and read a couple. So I read the book cover to cover as soon as I got the nomination, and I was so blown away. And I know that all the other jurors, and these are the great scholars and translators from around the world, who all had nominated important writers from mainland China, like Zheng Xiaoqiong, an important, relatively new voice, the face of migrant worker poetry movement, or Bei Dao, poet and voice of the Monglong Shi, the Misty Poetry movement, and beyond. So these were tremendously competitive field. This is the moment when we will confer the 6th Newman Prize for Chinese Literature to Xi.
And Xi said she actually would like to come say a few things.
Thank you very much.
And yet I think everyone in that moment stopped and thought, wait, let me take a moment to read her work as poetry. And one of the things that Xi's work does more widely, I think, is, like Ho Fok-yen said earlier, that Tammy, that you mentioned, is that she sees the world with a kind of gentle eyes, generous and gentle eyes. But the world isn't always gentle. But it does, in that childlike lens, allow for more space and time and more indeterminacy and play to create a different temporality of experience for reading. And that is what I would think of as a kind of poetic experience, even in the prose work. So even when, no matter what genre she's writing, and of course she's writing in all of them, and writing about other genres and filmmaking. And I think it's because of that, the intertextual nature of her work becomes a kind of poetics that, in a poem, because of the line breaks, right, we get the breath, we get the body that is, of course, a signature component of the lyric, and we get a little bit more of that space and silence that interpenetrates that prose doesn't quite allow for. But I believe deeply that in that summer where all of the jurors are reading Xi's work, that we were doing something in that process of deliberation that I'm hoping the prize then does for the wider English reading community, which is to take a second look at a writer and to think about that writer from a new perspective. So let me just talk for a moment about the Newman Prize and its function, and a little bit about its history. So it was established in 2009. The first winner was Mo Yan. Mo Yan then, within a few years, goes on to win the Nobel Prize, of course, but also other great writers, Han Shaogong, Zhu Tianwen, Wang Anyi, Yang Mu, and of course Xi. It's interesting that both Yang Mu and Xi won the Newman Prize and then went on to win the Sakata Prize very shortly after. So part of what makes a prize important is that it brings attention to a work, right? And other committees and other prizes keep doing it. It's not about winning prizes, it's about discoverability, making a work more readily, not just there, like a translation can put it on a shelf, a book can, or at least on Amazon or, another online book platform. But there's so many, you can't discover them. And so a prize shines a light on it. I want to read one other poem. It's only a couple lines long, just to kind of get at one of the struggles that I think translators have. This one is called 这不是诗, right? It is, this is not a poem. In English, it goes, this is not a poem, not a poem, a poem, poem. In Chinese, we have 这不是诗, 不是诗, 是诗, 诗, right? And so I think there's a direct reference here, another kind of intertextual layer that points back to Zhao Yuanren's famous poem, 诗是 the stone lion, or the eating a lion poet in Stone Den, or something like. There's these different things happening in the acoustic realm, which literally can't come into English. But she's so aware of this that her work, and I want to come back to this, is interlanguage, because Hong Kong is interlanguage. It is always happening in multiple languages, multiple registers and idiolects. Poetry, in a sense, makes a space for this because of the homophonic play that happens and the attentiveness of the reader. And the last thing I'll say is that Xi's readers, and I hope everyone listening becomes one, it is in your best interest to do so. Because the generosity and kindness that Ho Fengyan was talking about, I think it is contagious. And it is inside her line, the attentiveness to language and the willingness to let it be, misquoted, quoted, all of these things is what it kind of means to be a good person and to be in community with a heterogeneous openness to the world. That is, I think, the sort of definition of kindness and generosity that her work opens. And I'm so grateful that we had her at Oklahoma, and to meet the students and young writers and poets. And hopefully the prize has done its job, its function, to bring her work to a wider readership, because I honestly think that it's helps us as a species become better at being human. And that's not hyperbole. It's a small prayer, perhaps, for something grand that she makes available. Doesn't mean it does will come true until you read it. So I really hope everyone listening will do just that and read her poetry and read her fiction as poetry.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So we've been talking about interlanguages, intertextuality. Perhaps let's focus a little bit more on intertextuality. According to Julia Kristeva, any work of art or text is an intertext because it inevitably interacts with other works of art or texts. Intertextuality is interested in the connections between a text and other texts that can be found in it through a number of ways, including citation, quotation, imitation, parallelism, pastiche, etc., etc. Xi uses multimedia in her practice of incorporating Western elements in her writing. Her Marvels of a Floating City is a very obvious example. Marvels of a Floating City is divided into 13 sections, each responding to a painting by the Belgian surrealist painter René Magritte. The story presents the absurd, rootless mood of Hong Kong in the 1980s, ahead of the imminent handover. I believe that not only does Xi offer a uniquely contemporary Hong Kong interpretation of Magritte's artwork, she also transforms the pieces into useful materials to meditate on Hong Kong fears and experiences. And an argument perhaps can be made that the work by a Western painter is cross-culturally made into Hong Kong through Xi's work. And I would like to invite Jennifer to tell us a little bit more about her experience with Xi's work and also the intertextuality aspect of her writing.
Yeah, Tammy has brought up already many of the intertextual elements we find in Xi's work, beginning with what I believe was her very first published book, which is the novella East Side Story, in which it's not just an adaptation of an adaptation, but she also was really into film montage at that time. She herself was studying filmmaking and part of a cinema club, and she made her own film using scraps from newsreel, and then used the style of montage to put everything together. So she adapts that technique in East Side Story, and she puts a character named Xi into it as well, and also a dog. So she puts her own Xi spin, brings Hong Kong to this Western work. Many of her stories and poems, in particular, engage with fairy tales. And critics have talked about the fairy tale realism in her work. This is one of the terms that they use to describe it. So she has a short story called Glass Slippers, which is written like a travelogue in which the narrator, who's named Xi, travels to Cinderella's childhood home. So not the castle, but her childhood home. And she has a meal with the tour guide. And what's interesting is she sort of spins this idea of what is fantastic and what is real. In her short story, Cinderella's home becomes something very real, and Hong Kong is recast as something that's totally an unbelievable fairy tale. So she talks about how Cinderella is not impressive at all because in Hong Kong, people can adapt to anything. You know, more and more people are living in smaller and smaller spaces. If you're writing for a newspaper, you can write however many words the editor requests, not one more, not one less. In another short story, Apple, she uses the poisonous apple in Snow White to help understand the uncertainty that people were feeling about Hong Kong's future when Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping were in their discussions about the future of Hong Kong. This is back in '82. In that story, there is a pageant for apples. And so all of these apples from around the world compete. You have the apple that hit Newton's head, William Tell's apple, the so-called apple from the Garden of Eden, which the narrator notes was probably not an apple, but the winner is Snow White's apple. And everyone becomes obsessed with it because they want to fall into a deep sleep as they write out their uncertain future. So we see her playing with fairy tales in fresh ways to better understand Hong Kong. I wanted to briefly mention a very charming short story of hers called Beard Has a Face that has never been translated into English, in which she engages with an Italian author named Gianni Rodari's short stories from his collection Fairy Tales Over the Phone. And she uses Rodari's stories as a springboard to discuss various fairy tales and novels, including Little Red Riding Hood, The Little Match Girl, Snow White, and then she puts them in dialogue with The Never-Ending Story, Günter Grass's Headbirths, Milan Kundera's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, the classical Chinese novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber, and so on and so forth. And in this story, which is really interesting, I've done a very rough draft of translating it. There are two alternating narrators, and I just want to quote a very short passage. So the first narrator says, although the author of the fairy tale, in this case, they're talking about Gianni Rodari, has passed, the fairy tales can continue to grow. Then the other narrator asks, who can make fairy tales continue growing? And then the other narrator answers, readers. As long as a fairy tale has an audience and a fairy tale collection has readers, then fairy tales can continue growing. And I love this so much because I think for those of us who are missing Xi very much, we can think about how her work, you know, and how she herself is continuing to grow because of readers and how we engage with her work. And it encourages us to keep her stories going. And there are many, many other works where you can see various intertextual influences, such as another short story of hers called An Addendum to Cosmic Comics, in which she takes a dinosaur from one of Italo Calvino's Cosmic Comics stories, and she reimagines this dinosaur as the mascot for Hong Kong's anti-littering campaign. But in the story, she uses her faithful standby for Hong Kong, Fertile Soil Town. It's the same stand-in that we find in Apple, which lends this fairy tale element to Hong Kong. And as I've mentioned before, Mourning Abreast is a very elusive intertextual work. You know, when I started translating this, I didn't know what I was getting into. I thought I was just translating Xi. Oh no, I get to translate classical Chinese poetry, classical Chinese prose and philosophy, Greek philosophy, Madame Bovary from French, that was really fun, Mexican short fiction, and she also writes about music from Brazil, cinema from Europe, Hollywood, and Japan, and it's all kinds of cinema. So you get Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but then also like a film like Ikiru by Kurosawa. So it's just really interesting to see all these texts that she puts in conversation with each other. And I really feel like her writing is in conversation with anything and everything, and encouraging her readers to be as curious as she is, and bringing all these seemingly disparate works together and putting them in dialogue. But Hong Kong is always at the center, no matter what she's talking about. So I think I'll stop there and turn it back to Tammy and Jonathan to see what they think about Xi and intertextuality.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Do you happen to have found the poem I talked about earlier?
Oh, sure. Would you like me to now?
I think it would be a very good poem to share with all of us.
Okay, sure. So this is a poem that Xi embedded into her acceptance speech for the Newman Prize for Chinese Literature Poetry. So it was at the very end of the speech, and it's called A Salute to Translators. And I think from this you can really see how much she admires and appreciates her translators. I see a young friend in a bookstore. He comes over, asks whether I buy books in the original language or in translation. Translations, he accentuates, are rife with mistakes, misinterpretations, additions, and deletions. He maintains that when reading foreign language works, one must be well acquainted with the original text to avoid being led astray. Oh yes, if only I had a Tower of Babel, keys to every house, scoping out the various layouts, admiring each and every object, attuned to each unique sound, the fruits of blood and sweat. But I'm not young anymore. Friend, were it not for someone guiding me in a language I can understand, how would we know each other? Some things are lost in translation. Some, however, are gained. Great pains taken to attain the same goal. The challenge of taking stage with a changed face. A poem's journey is never complete. It will be read and misread, explored again and again, traveling to far-off places. The farther off, the better. Even God Almighty must rely on angels. The angels I know walk toward me. They aren't resounding gongs or clanging cymbals. They each have distinct personalities. They have love. So that's the poem.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I remember it very well. So we talked about different languages, and then and the uses of and the impacts of these languages. Jonathan, let's turn to you, and I would like you to perhaps in your experience and your role with the Newman Prize, can you talk a little bit about the place of Xi's works in the Anglophone and Sinophone literary worlds, and the interplay of these different worlds? Are they completely separate? How do they intersect? How do readers understand works written in different languages and translated into different languages?
These are great questions. Maybe before I jump right into responding to them, I just want to acknowledge that the poem I read, I think, is in conversation, with the poem that Jennifer just read. She says that things are lost and found in translation, but she's much more radical than that. She suggests that things are lost and found in language way before translation is involved, right? That life is, that is more lively than words, that there's so much more happening than words can capture. In Chinese, we could say like, 声音 voice, but it isn't one, is it? And yet it has one, doesn't it? Right? Like every word has its own sound and shape, texture and feel, memories associated with it that are independent of the grammar that is marshaling it toward a point. It ruptures our attempt to subordinate it to our will, and it lives as itself, as language. And that is where the gain comes in, right? That's the gain of translation. It's the gain of language, which is all words have their own voices and their own aesthetic possibility, of being enjoyed and being revered. Many words are sacred, but they also deceive because there's a promise that's never met in the relationship of language and meaning, right? And she's well aware of it, and she's well aware of it for the best reason I could possibly imagine. It's not that she made the linguistic turn after reading, structuralism and post-structuralism. I think it really happened in her decade as an elementary school teacher. It is her fierce loyalty to a kind of anti-adult chauvinism that willfully forgets the extraordinary capacity of young people to already know these things, but not need to know them to make them important. They experience them directly and without a kind of meta-awareness where we prosthetically reach for concepts like indeterminacy and playfulness of language, but also the awe and the fear that comes with its slipperiness, right? This in her creates what awe is, right? It's both wonder and terror. And young people, I think, live in an awareness of this that she, I think, works through and back toward creating the intertextual, right, that Kristeva is talking about. I also mentioned that, that Xi visited the Chinese Literature Translation Archive at the University of Oklahoma. We got to go through and kind of show her what's happening. And one of the people who's one of the 4 core collections, it's now 5, almost 6, but the 4 that were there was Yeweilian, Weilem Yip. Yip Weilem, is, as Jennifer points out in her wonderful introduction to Xi work, is one of Xi's mentors and a really important voice in Hong Kong poetry and poetics before it became an important voice in Taiwanese poetry, and then America, and then mainland China. Wang Jiaxin and others have pointed to this, as well as Xi's work. We haven't talked about how important she is for this broad community of writers and thinkers who are oftentimes, as is Yeweilian's work, very much living in that wider sense of Chinese at the widest possible scale, and self-aware as such, deeply learned, trying to reimagine what Chinese can do by literally, putting English grammatical structures into the Baihua, into colloquial Chinese, to try to shape poetry and, by cross-genre experimentation. Xi exists, I think, and lives in this lineage of language molding and shaping, which is to say consciousness expanding work. And so when we're there, I kind of get to show her some of the manuscripts and then show how, for someone who's a professional translator like Jennifer, you're dealing with, as you've mentioned before, agents. And the agents in America, they reshape work radically in order to, because the agent knows what the reader is interested in at a given time. They're closer to the market, as we say. Then the editor takes on the greatest risk, because if the editor takes on a book and brings it into the list and it doesn't make money, that's on the editor. So the editor also is really careful to ascertain, and through their own discernment, is this good? Will this meet audience expectations and surpass it? All of this happens in a very market-driven world, in the English Anglophone world, and Chinese literature is subject to it. And one of the things that's great about Xi's work, and great about, I think, all, for that matter, Sinophone literature, is that it is almost radically original in the sense that it very rarely ever passes through the sort of workshop that happens in English literature. So when an English reader reads a Sinophone text, in translation even, it's so much more authentic to that author's vision than would be almost any work in English. Because English is just, as value-add economics has penetrated it so deeply that it has become so mature in late capitalism to have been so thoughtful about audience expectations, and it's held to be accountable to that through the chain of publishing. That's what we do at our archive, is we look at the correspondence with editors and agents, look at the draft material, and you can see how many hands on a translation as it passes into English, and how English, this highly wrought language that has been so worked and reworked by so many sentient hands, it is a really unique and often, if not entirely neglected part of translation studies. The translation is not a negotiation between languages, but also between economies at scale, between different material cultures. It's a really radical form of civilizational, but also, economic negotiations. And I love the poem that she read and that Jennifer, you read, because that poem, talks about how someone thinks this translation as a mistranslation and so on. But we also actually don't know. Maybe Jennifer, your editor said we really want it this way, and you say no, but editors are more powerful than translators. So you don't know why a translation takes this turn or that turn, because there's a lot of different power differentials that over time have been really radical and have subordinated the voices of translators to try to, to get something that's rough and interesting and unusual, like idioms and things like that, into English. And a lot of editors will say, no, not that, sorry. And they at the end of the day, they call the shots.
Allow me to thank Jennifer and Jonathan for joining us today to talk about CC and the world. It is we covered so much and so many different topics, and I would like to thank Hong Kong Poetry Festival Foundation. I would like to thank Chris Song for inviting us, and also the on-site team, including Niu Chen, Yi Xian Li, and most of all Ting He, who has been coordinating everything for us. Thank you so much. And we have 4 episodes in the CC series. Please do pay attention to our social media posts. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Read
you.
Xi in every language.